Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. It's not unusual, is it, to come back from a holiday or a photo shoot with a batch of images, and I've just got 5 from probably 500 here, that we were quite inspired about when we raised the camera to our eye as we captured the pictures. A little later though, when we look at those same images, we often find that whatever it was that did inspire us seems to have evaporated over time. Now I find this to be very common myself, and I know that I'm not unique here, far from it. Now what we need to do in those circumstances is perhaps to put the images aside for a month or so and come back to them sometime later. When we do, what I find is I now don't seem to be quite so locked into the thoughts I had originally. All those now have drifted away, and that generally allows me to think a little more creatively. Here's something else that I've noticed quite a bit over the years too. How often does a quick and simple manipulation turn out a far more appealing image than one we've worked upon for ages? And perhaps there's a moral there somewhere. Now here the image that I've shot looks flat and lifeless because my camera doesn't capture exactly what I see. Many people believe cameras do, but here is the evidence that they don't. What we need to do is to put back the appeal and impact we saw at the time we took the shot. But now we can add a little creative thought too, by creating a simple and yet effective montage, just 2 images, maybe 3, just to add that extra interest. So what we're looking at with a montage is a combination of 2 images where the result is greater than the sum of the 2 parts, or 3 in our case. Now whenever I'm out with a camera, I always take images when I see them, like you can see with the half dozen I have on screen here. Flaking paint, rusty metal, old timber. I've lost track of the number of times I've been able to use images like this in simple 2-image montages, which is basically what we're going to do here, and create something a little bit different. As you can see here, I've opened up the core part of our montage. This is what's going to create most of the interest within the broadly 2 images we're going to use. But normally when I open up an image, my first port of call is over here on the right hand side to the lens corrections, and I would be ticking to remove the chromatic aberration. But I think this image may be a good one to demonstrate exactly what that is and why we need to remove it. So I'm going to zoom in very tight on that wheel, and you can see quite clearly there where we've got a dark subject against a light background. The known distortion in our lens is causing that coloured fringing. Now at normal size we may find it hard to see that, but if we start to crank up the colour for any reason, we could make this chromatic aberration even worse. The great thing about Photoshop is it defeats it so brilliantly, and I'll demonstrate that by just ticking the box. And there you can see the chromatic aberration gone completely. I'm going to hit Ctrl 0, so now we can make our start. I'm going to go back to the main tab or the basic tab, and I need to think about what we're going to do because we've got 2 images we want to put together, so how do we know what manipulation each one of them needs to work well? Well, in truth, we don't. A little later, when I get this image opened up into Photoshop and combined in layers with the background image which I'm going to use, which is going to be a piece of timber, I need to have access back to Camera Raw to make a change to one layer or both. Now to do that, I'm going to go to my hyperlink down at the bottom of the Adobe Camera Raw here, click it, and I'm going to make sure I've got this little box ticked to open this up as a smart object in Photoshop. That way I can always come back to Camera Raw. So back to what we're going to do with this image. Well, we don't exactly know, do we? But generally speaking, I'm going to give it a little bit of colour. It is a bit weak on colour. I'll give it a little bit of clarity, and it's beginning to come alive a little bit, isn't it? I can possibly drop down some of the highlights maybe to enhance the sky a little bit. But if I went any further here, I would be just guessing. I think that's as good a place as any to start our montage, so I can open this up as an object in Photoshop. Once the image is open, a quick look into layers. There's the Smart Object status icon that tells us we can open this back up into Camera Raw. What I need to do now is to go back to Bridge and choose the texture. Now I think, and I've not tried this, but I'm going to make a statement here that practically every one of these would probably work reasonably well with the image I've chosen. But I'm going to choose something pretty simple. Let's go for either this one or that one, and I think this one is going to be my choice. So once again, highlight the thumbnail, double click, and we will open that image up into Adobe Camera Raw. We need to do the same thing as we did before. I'm going to go to my lens corrections and remove any chromatic aberration, and then back to the basic tab. Again, what do I need to do here? Well, again, I'm not entirely sure. That's the nature of the creative way we have to work when we're putting montages together. I'm not too keen on the way the cracks in the boards lean in here. I'd like to straighten things up a little bit, but I can do that when I get it into Photoshop and combined with the other image. I can wait until I see how it looks. So what am I going to do here? Well, again, I'm guessing a little bit, knowing I can come back and adjust it if I want. I don't think I need a great deal of colour in the background because this is going to provide the texture. I'll step up the clarity a little bit, maybe even the contrast a little bit. Well, let's move up the whites. Look at the histogram, a little bit deficient on the white, so let's raise that a little bit, and that's going to have the benefit, I think, of increasing the contrast a little bit. I think that's as far as I need to go, and once again I'm going to open this up as a smart object in Photoshop. Once this image appears on screen, I need to click the tab for the previous one and just drag it out, and from the toolbox up at the top left here, pick up the Move tool. Holding the Shift key, I'm going to click, drag and drop my main subject into that piece of timber. Holding the Shift key just allows the image to drop 4 square on top of the other image. Now I can close this one down because I've got both of the others in layers, and there you can see both of them are smart objects. Not a bad idea at this stage to save this as the start of our montage project. If you've watched other tutorials I've made, you may have heard me say this before, but we often make decisions on our images which we think are the best things since sliced bread. And we look at the image in the cold light of the next day and wonder what possessed us to do what we did the day before. It's always a good idea to save a series of projects when we're working through an image like this, so if we need to, we've always got an escape route back to various stages of the image. The worst thing that happens when we've completed the image is we can dump all those earlier versions. To begin the montage process, we're going to blend one layer with the other from within the Layers palette, and we're going to use one of the drop-down blend modes. Now, to save just a little bit of time, I'm going to suggest that you should try practically all of these, but there are a few which you would get used to after a while as favourites. The one that works best in this particular case is Multiply. Now I'm going to short circuit things and just select that, but what you'll also notice is it does make the image just a little bit on the dark side. Now I think we can fix that quite easily by selecting the woodwork in Layers. Remember, we've opened this up as a smart object, so we've got the opportunity to go straight back into Camera Raw, which I'll do with a double click. We can adjust maybe the exposure of that woodwork so we lighten the appearance of the image. How much exposure do I put into the woodwork? Well, again, in truth, I don't really know, but it doesn't matter because I can come back here a dozen times. Let's try to bring it up to something around 1, just a little bit over 1. When I click OK, Photoshop will update the image that's in place, and as soon as the green bar reaches the right hand side, we'll get a good idea of how the image is going to look. And that, I hope you'll agree, makes a considerable difference. I quite like the way it's slightly darker on the right hand side and even the left hand side and the bottom. That, I think, is going to assist us. Now, I'm happy with the change I've just made, but knowing that what I have just done is changeable at any time, I'm quite happy to save this version over the top of the previously saved version, which I called Montage 1. When we come to decide what to do with a creative image like a montage, of course I always say that there are some rights and wrongs with manipulation, but also quite a large amount of personal choice. Well, probably you could argue more personal choice in this situation than many. And looking at my picture, I'd like to try to bring through a bit more warmth from the brickwork in the image there, and maybe through the main centre part of the whole montage. So I'm going to go back to my layers. This time I'm going to double click my main subject and open that back up into Camera Raw. So there are no rights and wrongs here. I could choose to push up the vibrance, the saturation, a little bit of both. I'm going to push the temperature up a little bit. I'm going to warm the whole image up. Remember, this again is easy to change if it doesn't work when I open this up in a few seconds. But I think that looks okay, so I'm going to give it a whirl. We'll just give Photoshop a few seconds to open that up, and we can see if the change we've made is to our liking. I think it just gives it a little more appeal. Now, one area I'd like to bring a little more tone through is in that top left, the sky. So I'm going to try that by going to my layers. And this is the great thing about having the smart objects, where we can select either one and just have them open in Camera Raw in a few seconds. Now, I lightened that quite a bit because I wanted the overall effect for the majority of the image, but I'd like the top to darken down a little bit. So maybe I could select my graduated filter here. Thinking of the sort of shape of that sky, it sort of comes down something like that, doesn't it? So I'll drag it down at the slant slightly. I'll drop the, let's double click the exposure and we'll see what we started with. There's what we started with. So what I want to do is to take down that exposure. I'm going to take it down quite a lot. Remember, again, we can always come back and adjust this if it doesn't work, or we can adjust the length of the graduated filter I've put in. I can just drag this down or take it back. Let's click OK and take a look. Hopefully that will bring the tones down in the top left, but if it doesn't, I've got the sky in the other image to fall back on as well. Now that's not too bad, but I think it's gone just a wee bit too far. So what I would be doing here is just going back into Camera Raw, backing off that graduated filter just a touch, but as I keep saying, you may like that, and you may wish to keep it just as it is. Now, if I go back in and take off some of that exposure, I'm going to affect areas up here and here. But really, I'm just looking at this area here. This is the part where I want that shape to just stand out a little bit more bold than it is. So why don't we just try and do something with that localized area? Now, zeroing in on that by looking at the board, let's go back to our layers. Let's open up that background. There's the area I'm referring to, but if I go back to my graduated filter, I need to click the pin to bring it back live so I can adjust it. In the later versions of Photoshop Camera Raw, what we can do now is adjust the graduated filter with a brush. If I go over to the right hand side and click the brush, you can see we've got the opportunity to remove from the graduated filter or add to it. I want to remove some of the tone. Now the size controls the brush size. Now the inner ring is the solid part of the brush. From there to the dotted ring we've got a graduated effect. So I'm going to use the square bracket keys to drop that down to something like that. That looks about right to do that area. Now we need to go back to the flow. I want the flow to be really low. It's always a good idea to start the flow as low as we possibly can and gradually build up. But what I can now do is just taking a look over to the right hand side, and I've got that minus set. So all I'm going to do is to move over this area, and you can see how I can just lighten that little spot. I'm going to click to open this and have a look to see if that's done the job. Now once my image opened back up, I found that it worked just about perfectly, but I hadn't gone high enough with that brushing towards the top edge of the image. So I just reopened it into Camera Raw, selected the graduated filter, selected the brush in its minus operation, and just did a little bit more of the removal of the density of that area. When the image opened up, I felt it was so successful that I felt that I could have a go at the top right, which had gone rather dark given that I dragged down the tone of the woodwork, and it had taken away all the colour in the trees. So a little bit of the same work at the top right, and we end up with what we can see here. Now I think I'm ready to do some fine tuning here and to straighten up those boards. So we need to go into the layers and select the layer we want to work on. Because I'm just going to work on one layer, which is the wooden boards, I can go to my edit menu, transform, and I'm going to choose distort. And you can see what happens here, because all I'm trying to do here is to just straighten up these boards a little bit. I don't need a lot of work to be done here, but I just want to have them more or less straight there. And this side I think I'll do the same, just dragging this out. That doesn't look too bad, a little bit of a curve there, but that's fine. Just looking around the image. Now that crisscross effect across the centre there, I'll show you what that means in a second. I'm hitting the enter key to commit the transformation of that woodwork. Because we've got this selected as a smart object, we're able not only to double click the thumbnail and go back to Camera Raw, but if I opened up that distort tool again, I can make one change on top of another on top of another, safe in the knowledge that I'm not affecting the quality of my image because I'm always working on the basic raw file. It doesn't hurt when we're putting together images like this to look at them for a while. If you've got the ability or the patience to save this, and I'm just hitting Control S because I'm saving over the top of the previously saved version. Don't feel I need a new version yet because everything I've done is changeable. But if you've got the patience to save this as a Photoshop file and come back tomorrow, it's not a bad idea to do that. In many of the montages we may be putting together, there's often the need, once we've got the two images together and blended and balanced as we have here, that we may find aspects of the main subject are a little bit too strong. Now in this particular image I think I've just got lucky and they're balanced pretty well. But you do have the opportunity to put a layer mask on here. I'll just do it as a demonstration. To pick up black as your foreground colour, pick up a soft edge brush, which is what I have here. Drop the flow rate down to something like 5 or 10. I'll go to 5. So for example, if there was an obtrusive area of the subject that I wanted to remove, I could start to remove it or just make it a little bit more faded than it originally was. In this image, as I've said, I don't think we need to do any of that at all. But you are going to use layer mask quite a bit when you put your montages together. So there, it's a quick and easy thing to do. And bear in mind, of course, with a mask, you can always undo it. So even if you did it a little bit and wanted to undo a little bit of it, you can do that. But of course, if you're experimenting, as I have by demonstrating to you, I can just drop that straight in the bin. I said a few moments ago that if you've got the patience to leave this and come back another day, it's not a bad thing to do, because there are so many ways we could go with this image. We've got the opportunity to adjust that background texture. We could put far more contrast in it if we wanted to. We could swap it for some old rusty metal and see how that works. We can adjust the image that's in front of the texture. We can make it a sepia tone, a monochrome. We could add more colour, remove colour. There's so much we can do. Add noise. It's all creative and therefore all fair game. But I'm going to stay with what I've got here, because when I looked at this, I felt that the composition was fairly good, but I wanted something a little bit more interesting here. So I started thinking about introducing a third aspect in my montage. But I thought, well, I shot a lot of old advertisements from the walls of these buildings, and I went and looked for one, and that's what we're going to put in that section of the wall. Now I've chosen a colour which I think is going to go well with the warm colours of the brickwork. So let me take you back into Bridge and we'll open up the image into Camera Raw. There's the image that I found and I felt would work quite well. So I'm just going to double click this and open this up into Camera Raw. Once again, I don't think we're going to need to do much work with this, if anything. If I wanted to deal with the chromatic aberration, I would deal with that, although I don't think it's going to be an issue here. Maybe a little bit of clarity. I don't think I need any more exposure, and I don't think I need any more colour. But as I said earlier on, we're not sure at this stage. So let's open this up. Remember, this is being opened up as a smart object too. In the few seconds it'll take, I'll tell you that we need to drag out that top tab when it appears. And with the move tool selected, I can click drag and drop. Close that one down, and again I've got another image here which is infinitely changeable, so I'm quite happy to hit Ctrl S and save over the top of my previously saved version, because everything in my layered stack is changeable and editable at any time. Non-destructive editing. Now the Jack Crabtree advertisement is too big, it's the wrong shape, so I think the first thing we need to do is to remove the background, the parts of this image that we don't want. So effectively we've got to cut out the plaque. Remember, we've got a smart object here, so far all the work we've done is non-destructive, so I'm quite happy to hit Ctrl S to save over my previously saved version, which is still Montage 1. Now let's make a selection of this, which is going to be quite easy to do. I'm going to click and drag to zoom in to the top left corner. I'm going to pick up my polygonal lasso tool, click right at the top, move a little distance and click again, a distance and click again and click again. I can't go from one corner to the other because sometimes these wooden boards are slightly curved. When I run out of space on screen, if I touch the space bar, the tool I'm using is temporarily suspended. I can click and drag, release the spacebar, and I'm back in business. So you can see it don't take any time at all to get across to the other side. And once I do, then of course I change tack and I start moving down. Now, if you get a little bit worried about doing these sorts of things, what you can do is do them in sections. Not a bad idea. This is rather a big section. I wouldn't suggest you do one quite as big as this, but let me demonstrate what I mean. You see, once I've made my first selection, let me whiz back to the other side. Once I've made my first selection, as long as I check this box here, you get a little plus. So now I can relax with this in the bank, so to speak. I can start there and I can add another bit. So if you want to just do things like this, even that doesn't take too long before you've actually made a pretty good selection. Certainly a selection good enough for what we're about to do here. So I'm going to continue and make that selection around the outer edge. Now once I have the selection of the plaque made, I can choose to cut that out. Now it's probably not a bad idea to do that. Now we cannot cut it out from the background with Ctrl X. If I did that, nothing would happen. I'll do it for you. Ctrl X is what I've just hit. Nothing's happened at all. because we're working on a smart object. So we cannot cut out from a smart object, but what we can do is copy and paste. So we can keep the original up our sleeve should we need it. Probably not in this case, but in some, yes. I'm going to go to Refine Edge first. We don't want to cut this out too sharp, so I'm going to give perhaps a 2 pixel feather around the edge just to give a little softness to that selection. Now you can go to the edit menu, but I'm going to hit Ctrl C to copy, Ctrl V to paste. When I now take you back into the layers, you can see what we have. I can turn off my original smart object layer because now I've got the plaque sitting there ready for use. Now, because I'm using a computer that's actually quite old, I'm not going to put quite so much pressure on this little computer as I would my main one. So on this occasion, just to help me out, I'm going to highlight that and get rid of it just by hitting the delete key. I'm quite happy that I don't need it anymore. And what I can do once again, of course, is hit Ctrl S if I want to save over the top of the previously saved version. A great shortcut that. Now I can reselect the plaque because I need to size and adjust the shape to match the perspective of the brickwork I'm going to place it against. I'm going to use my distort tool to create the right shape and get the right size, but just in case I don't get this right, what I'm also going to do, because I copied this plaque to a new layer, this layer now isn't a smart object. Well, I can now make it a smart object. If I go to my layers menu, I can go down here, choose smart objects and convert to a smart object. And the reason and benefit of doing that is when I go to edit, transform and distort, you can see that crisscross effect here, which means that when I place my plaque where I want it, now you can see how that's going down in comparison to the roof there, and I need this to be much smaller as well. So I'm going to bring these up just using my own judgment here. I think we don't need it too big, but that needs to be vertical. I can click inside and move it into position. Now I can look at the brickwork along the top in relation to the top of the sign. I can straighten the sign up in relation to the crack in the boards there, maybe even come up a little bit here. I think I want to try to come up, I'm going to make it a bit smaller I think. I want it to come up above the area here because that's quite an interesting area. So you see I'm whittling it down and making my decisions as I go. So now I think I've got the size more or less right, so now it's fine tuning. A little bit bigger here to get the perspective right. That maybe could come down a little bit more. When I'm happy, I'm going to hit the tick on the options bar. Now, if I wasn't happy with what I'd done, because I changed it to a smart object, I can go back to that transform tool and I can jiggle this as many times as I wish. But it looks pretty good to me and it's doing what I want, but it's a little bit too bold. So why don't we just try using that darken? No, not working so well. Multiply? No, not working so well. Overlay? Not too bad, but I think I'd like it better than that. Soft light? And hard light? Well, there we've got a problem, because all of the options that I like, I want to keep the blue colour. I think the blue is great against the warm colours, but it's a bit too bold. Well, let's turn to the opacity then. Just drop that down a little bit. And we're all going to choose something different, but there it is, look, nicely blended in. And remember, if there was parts of this you wanted to blend in more than others, you could add a mask. Infinite variety of ways we can work here. Now I've just saved this as Montage 2. This is one of those pieces of work where really you could keep going for hours and hours and hours with so many different ways you could approach this image and make changes to it. But in the interests of bringing this to a close, I'm going to go back to my layers and I'm going to say, just for the moment, I'm going to flatten this image and say it's more or less a finished piece of work. Not a bad idea though, just to look at the levels, because we've mixed all these images together.
We've got a little bit of a deficiency in the light tones, but then again, we've got lots of dark tone in the image and it looks good. So don't allow the histogram or to follow the histogram blindly, but take a look sometimes just to make sure that a little tweaking with the sliders is not going to give you an improvement, and there you can decide if you feel that is an improvement or not. I don't think it's too bad, so I'm quite happy with that. And then I would be looking at just isolated spots, maybe this little light area here, and maybe that little light patch. There's always going to be the odd little part which we may want to touch with some of the other tools of Photoshop. Spot healing brush, for example. We've got a few little white spots around here. They're not significant, but other montages they may be, and you can turn to these tools to fix those problems. There's one there that can be wiped out. A little bit of a gap up there which we can fill in with a few touches. They're the tiny attention to detail jobs which I think are quite important. But again, we've got the opportunity to choose the burn tool, mid-tones, a low exposure, so if we wanted to do something with the boards in a localized area, we've got the opportunity to do that too. So quite often we can make quite a stunning montage with a simple two-layered approach. Here we've introduced a third aspect which I think just helps with the colour contrast, because we've got that lovely mix now of warm tones and cool tones. Yes, we're drawn to the plaque because it's got writing on it, but we're also drawn to the big area up at the top left because it's a strong shape against the timber woodwork. It all hangs together reasonably well.